Y luego se meterá más.
Sí, pero hay 6 conexiones, que luego igual hay más de 2.
Ah, sí.
Claro, igual detrás de una de esas conexiones hay un frontón
Rubén,
lleno de gente.
Un momento.
No están haciendo el evento.
Rubén. Vale. Si hay preguntas, les mandas un chat. Si queréis hacer una pregunta, yo también lo voy a decir, ¿vale?
El viejo topo. La revista del viejo topo. De la librería de guión de este.
¿Y dónde lo tienes?
¿Cómo te pones?
Para entrar, para que entremos en la imagen. Bueno.
Ay, que no se presenta. Machi, esto tienes que presentar esa. No nos presentes. No, después en la comida.
Sí, ¿os presento?
No, luego nos presentamos personalmente nosotros.
En la comida. ¿Por qué?
Públicamente no.
Vale.
Si fuera que vamos a hablar.
Ya. Bueno, pues venga, ¿empezamos ya?
Sí, ¿no? O sea,
No, es a la hora, es pasada, ¿eh?
Esperamos a Anthony, ¿eh?
Pasada la hora, ¿eh?
Bueno.
Está en el baño.
No va a hablar ahora, Anthony, ya vendrá. Sí.
no, ya, pero para que esté...
Creo que una mentalidad muy televisiva.
Sí, hombre, hay que aprender. Hay que adaptarse.
Sí, como...
Tenemos y un poco tenemos que mejorar, porque ya ves que hemos tenido.
Me parece que el tema no le interesa a nadie.
Ayer vino más.
No, yo creo que nosotros que no hemos sabido.
Yo creo que el tema no le interesa.
No, yo creo que es que no hemos sabido. Al final, Marión, ¿viene?
Yeah, she's bringing.
Bueno, ya, eso serán. Ahí no hemos tenido que hacer mucho esfuerzo.
Sí, de verdad.
Bueno, las cosas de la vida.
Bueno, buenos días a todas y a todos y también a los que estáis conectados al streaming. Bueno, iniciamos hoy el taller y el encuentro, la segunda parte del taller y encuentro que hacer bajo la subsunción real. Y queríamos un poquito, antes de empezar con la presentación, con la charla de Anthony Iles, decir unas palabras nosotros, ¿no? Aitor, Machín y yo, en relación un poco a cómo surge esta iniciativa. Ayer ya os explicaba que dentro de las líneas de programa de Bulegua, una de ellas es EGB, Educación General Básica, dentro de la cual pues hemos programado diferentes lecciones didácticas, las llamamos, sobre diversas cuestiones, y también hemos invitado a diversos participantes o invitados a dirigir esas lecciones, ¿no? Entre ellos artistas, pero también académicos o también provenientes, o incluso coreógrafos, y también provenientes de distintas disciplinas, ¿no? Sobre todo con esa intención de ser didáctico, ¿no? De no tanto educar sino aprender. Y en ese sentido, este grupo de lectura, que dentro de GB también hemos realizado otros grupos de lectura y realmente en Bulegua nosotras también a través del proyecto del contrato el grupo de lectura se ha convertido en una herramienta metodológica de trabajo, de nuestro trabajo colectivo, ¿no? Tanto aquí como a nivel curatorial, cuando nos invitan a realizar otros proyectos fuera de este espacio. Y en ese sentido, en el sentido de querer aprender, es un poco uno de los primeros deseos o motores que nos llevó a organizar este seminario. Todo empezó con un grupo de lectura sobre un texto de Ray Brasier en Musac, en el laboratorio 987 que propuso Machín para ese proyecto. Y en el viaje en coche de Bilbao a León, pues fuimos un poco preguntándole a Machín, pero también discutiendo un poco sobre cuál era la dimensión política de ciertas corrientes filosóficas que de alguna manera están muy en boga dentro del debate artístico, cultural, pero también desde las ciencias humanas, sociales, en relación sobre todo en relación al objeto y a la relación entre objeto y sujeto, ¿no? Y bueno, a partir de esa primera lectura en León y también, bueno, por nuestro interés desde hacía años por querer saber más sobre estas nuevas corrientes filosóficas y cuál es un poco su lectura o efecto dentro sobre todo del contexto artístico, de las artes visuales, pero también desde la coreografía, pues se inició un poco como esta discusión. También coincidía con un texto que justamente Ray Brasier había presentado en Berlín, ¿no? Dentro de un congreso sobre aceleracionismo. Y bueno, y aquí os paso un poco, ¿no? Porque
pues,
tú nos
sí.
comentaste de
Bueno,
ese texto,
también
¿no? Que era Wandering Abstraction, ¿no?
Otro texto que también comentamos en León fue un texto que escribí yo sobre la improvisación y la comunicación, que a su vez, bueno, pues gente que está aquí me ayudó también a revisarlo, como Anthony, Marina y Ray. Entonces, pues hay una serie de conexiones que las trataré de explicar brevemente, y es, por ejemplo, que me sorprendió mucho en el simposium sobre el aceleracionismo que Ray tratase de manera tan, yo creo que precisa, algunos temas de la comunicación, en contraposición al aceleracionismo. Entonces, Anthony de repente me dice que estaba trabajando en un texto sobre la subsumpción, y entonces le dije, pues mira, justo Ray acaba de escribir un texto que trata también la subsunción. Se lo pasé a Anthony y Anthony sugirió publicarlo en la revista Mute. Pero de ahí hubo una serie de diálogos, o sea que Anthony ya se puso en contacto con Ray y se depuró el texto hasta llegar a lo que es ahora el texto Wandering Abstraction, que hasta cierto punto ha sido como el punto de partida del grupo de lectura, pero también del taller, y a lo largo del día se verán bastantes referencias a este texto. Entonces, de ahí Anthony me comentó que había pedido a Ana Olori una respuesta al texto de Ray, que es la que escucharemos hoy. Pero a su vez tenemos a Marina y a Enoch, que también están respondiendo a ciertos aspectos, sobre todo lo que ya veremos, que es la paradoja de la autoabolición, algo bastante complicado que se tratará desde diferentes puntos de vista. Entonces, ya vemos que hay una conversación con los participantes más o menos del taller, pero nosotros al mismo tiempo pues estábamos tratando de aprender sobre todos estos temas que son bastante novedosos para nosotros en el grupo de lectura que hemos tenido desde abril. Son temas complejos, pero yo creo que nos ha dado pie a unas discusiones muy, muy interesantes.
Igual, Aitor, puedes hablar un poco, ¿no? Para que un poco poner en contexto de cómo hemos trabajado en el grupo de lectura, porque lo has coordinado, o sea, sobre todo lo has llevado tú
Pues,
aquí? Porque
digo que
Maxi no
está ya
estaba.
explicado, o sea, realmente al final, o sea, en un principio, eso, Wandering Abstraction, el texto de repente funciona como arranque, pero además de funcionar como texto como punto de partida, se mantiene constantemente, porque también en el punto de partida estaba el texto de Toscano sobre prometeanismo, pero ese texto luego se olvida, o sea, no se mantiene como el de Ray se mantiene constantemente en todas las sesiones a través de las respuestas que has explicado tú, y es como un poco lo que vertebra, por un lado, las lecturas que hemos hecho en el grupo de lectura, pero también el interés ese original que decías tú en las conversaciones del León de... O sea, realmente el grupo de lectura al principio no iba a ser sobre comunicación, estaba más vinculado a cuestiones de la posición, bueno, pues ha hablado de realismo especulativo, de gente que estaba escribiendo en esa onda y de qué posicionamiento político, qué concepción de la política tenían, y luego de forma natural hemos ido a la comunicación, pero, o sea, no sé, Wandering Abstraction es como un texto que tiene, como que vincula ahí esos, los intereses originarios que están ahí en ese texto, que se mantiene hasta el final, tampoco... Luego las lecturas, pues no sé...
Los textos de Notes nos sirvieron mucho
Sí.
para entrar en el concepto de comunicación, ¿no? Para lograr un poco, no sé, entenderlo mejor, ¿no?
Sí,
Tenían
y
como...
las traducciones de Federico.
Sí, gracias a las traducciones de Federico.
Y no sé qué más.
Claro, es que algo muy importante que yo creo que tanto EndNotes como Federico ayer es la contextualización. ¿De dónde vienen estas discusiones que son bastante oscuras? No, bueno, han estado son muy difíciles de seguir, tampoco hay mucha información y entonces pues yo creo que al que se acerca por primera vez es como que le pilla un poco de imprevisto, o sea, es difícil, es que está en contraposición a corrientes que hemos estado mucho más cercanos, que puede ser un poco la autonomía o otras corrientes marxistas, pero yo creo que estas teorías más cercanas a la comunicación, pues yo creo que lo llevan un poco a un terreno más extremo. Una nota es decir que porque el texto de Notes también responde a Rey, al texto de Rey, y Rey va a responder también al texto de Notes, hemos cambiado el orden. Entonces, así, Rey será el último. Y entonces, pues tiene lógica que responda también al texto de Notes.
Sí, también antes de dar paso ya por fin a Anthony, decir unas cuestiones a nivel de logística. Bueno, para los que estamos aquí, también para los que están detrás, bueno, en sus casas. A la 1:30 vamos a terminar, vamos a comer de 1:30 a 3:30. Bueno, later we will tell you in English about this, it's about logistics. Entonces, la idea es comer de 1:30 aquí a 2:30 y a partir de las 2:30 ir a la taller porque hay una inauguración hoy. Entonces, una vez más, ¿no?, nos hemos puesto de acuerdo con la taller, que es otro espacio del barrio de Solocoche, para poder hacer compatibles ambas actividades. Entonces, va a haber un vermú y iremos los que queramos a la inauguración de Gema Inchausti. Y bueno, la comida, o sea, la pone Bulegua, o sea que estáis todos invitados a quedaros a comer. Y lo digo también para los de streaming porque, bueno, pues ese es el espacio que queda como de descanso, de 1:30 a 3:30. Y luego que si queréis hacer desde casa algunas preguntas, bueno, pues que Rubén va a estar con el chat y entonces pues que estaría muy bien que también la gente que está afuera pues participe si es que quiera, ¿no? So maybe that people who is in the chat, they can ask questions, so that could be really nice.
Y luego lo del grupo de lectura también, que se quiera apuntar a la última sesión de mañana, que se apunte y que se le envía, o le damos el texto aquí, o
copias, ¿no?
¿Hay copias?
Sí, están las copias.
O se le envía.
Vale, creo que, bueno, leeremos un texto de Notes, el texto de Notes, hay copias físicas ahí, también se puede mandar el archivo y mañana de 11 a 2.
Vale, pues ya está.
Y a partir de ahora en inglés, ¿no?
Sí, ahora vamos a... Bueno, voy a hacer la presentación. I'm going to do the introduction in Spanish of Anthony. You know your biography.
I know, yep.
And then we will start speaking in English. Maybe for the debate, we can try to do some translation as we did yesterday, so people can, you know, like participate and be more helpful with that. So we will improvise like yesterday, so probably we will not be doing perfect, but we will try, okay? Bueno, pues deciros que abrimos hoy con Anthony Iles, que es un escritor y editor residente en Londres. Y bueno, sus textos, o sea, escribe tanto teoría como ficción. Por otro lado, también es candidato a doctor por la Universidad de Middlesex y contribuye como editor y escritor para la revista Mute, la revista online Mute. Comentaros que entre sus publicaciones destacan The Lowerly Ballet and Fan Palace and Creative Prison, sobre nociones sobre la arquitectura flexible, participación y regeneración en el contexto de las Olimpiadas de Londres del 2012. Noise and Capitalism, que es un libro que editó junto a Machine y que justamente fue publicado por Artelecu en el 2009, o No Room to Move, Radical Art and the Regenerated City, que escribió junto a Josephine Berry Slater, publicado por Mute en 2010. Y bueno, comentaros que también de manera independiente colabora con diversos artistas y de manera muy intensa con diversos artistas y músicos, organizando charlas, debates, discusiones, talleres, exposiciones y proyecciones, ¿no? Y bueno, sin más, le cedo la palabra a Anthony. Lo que vamos a hacer, si os parece bien, es su texto no es tan largo como otros, y lo que le interesa es que inmediatamente después lo abramos a preguntas. So his text is not that long, so he's really willing for opening straight after to some questions. But then after Marina's presentation, we will also have a debate between the two of them and us. Okay, so thank you.
Thanks a lot. Okay, so what I'll present might seem at first a little bit oblique to maybe a direct discussion of communalisation, but in some ways it maybe sort of sets out some of the ground which it breaks from and has a kind of relation to. I'll maybe towards the end of the paper get closer to what the connections with communalisation might be. But essentially kind of my main object for discussion is the Frankfurt School, so the group of German thinkers, Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Walter Benjamin, Friedrich Pollock, and Herbert Marcuse. But also there's a kind of certain sort of convergence or overlap around a certain sort of kind of reception of concepts which largely stem from Marx, but I'll talk about those. So these three concepts, reification, alienation, and subsumption, each claiming some foundation in the work of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, have all undergone substantial debate and attention by Marxist thinkers throughout the long 20th century. In this fairly distributed tradition, I perceive a kind of convergence around notion of total domination, attached to different readings of each of these concepts and at the site of different historical impasses for the left. Yet, this spectre of total domination, which haunted the 20th century, can be refuted in at least two ways. One is historical, depending on who you read and when exactly, like what these accounts give of when exactly this total domination took hold. And how has class struggle outlived it? The other kind of critique would be more conceptual, grounded in Marx's description of the ontology of labour power itself. So sort of following this kind of analysis, if we give up on one pole of a social relationship, which is capitalism, when, say, labour no longer becomes labour or capital no longer capital, then what form of capitalism are we describing exactly? And what on earth would we ground that description in? So I'll come back to these 2 points at the end. So firstly, these three concepts. Alienation, in Karl Marx's account, describes the separation of a worker from the products of her labour, and consequently the separation from her own activity itself. This basic premise and subsequent extension of alienation, or of accounts of alienation, through capital's intensification of processes of autonomisation, is a kind of sufficiently abhorrent picture, gives a sufficiently abhorrent picture, description of a situation. So extending, my argument is going to be that extending or projecting this concept into an existential framework is unnecessary. The account of Marx's account of the kind of removal of the worker from the products of their own labour and from their own labouring capacity is kind of like a sufficient problem to want to overthrow capitalism, rather than kind of raising it to an existential condition. So this, however, this existential apprehension of alienation is developed as a strong theme of Western Marxism, from Georgi Lukács via Theodor Adorno to Guy Debord. This sort of circuit has produced a sequence of misguided assertions and positions with regard to understanding the prospects for the end of capitalist society, and this requires some detailed unpacking, which I'll try to do in this paper. Subsumption in Marx's description in Capital Volume 1, and some notes which are usually published with Capital Volume 1, the results of the immediate process of production, pertains strictly to the description of the production process. And this has been asserted in endnotes texts, A History of Subsumption, and also some other texts which kind of follow up and give recent accounts of subsumption. Attempts to use the term to describe the rationalisation of aspects of social life falter because the category ceases to critically describe a dynamic relation between formal subsumption, which would be the employment of relations of production as capital finds them, and real subsumption, which would involve the seizure and development of social production in capital's own image and as it suits capital's ends. Attempts to use subsumption as a category of periodization, as endnotes have pointed out, are problematic because the dynamic itself begins to take on transhistorical characteristics. Not only do forms of real and formal subsumption coexist, they are distributed extremely unequally geographically. They can effectively appear to take place in branches of industry, and we can perceive a shift from one stage to another, but equally those industries may move geographically, resettle, and reincorporate the earlier stage in a new setting and integrate it vertically into a global system of production, which includes both highly developed technological production and apparently artisanal or primitive forms. And like a very, kind of central, kind of, a good example would be to think of coltan mining. So like the mineral that are the batteries on our mobile phones and devices like this one, computers, depend on is this mineral called coltan, which is mined famously in the Congo, but also elsewhere all over the world, in China. and that, so that's, yeah, and that involves exactly this very sort of primitive forms of production, extraction, but also extremely high-tech production. So to understand that subsumption is both complete and a constantly continuous and repeated revolution points to capital as a dynamic rather than an unfolding history of stages of domination. I think in various ways this also challenges the foundations of a widespread existentialism, which consider like this moment as kind of new or terminal. And particular examples of this would be like Frank Biffo Berardi or Mark Fisher, Frederick Jameson to a certain extent, who sort of picture a kind of historical development where we're kind of at some sort of end time now, or and discuss a sort of impossibility of the future as well. And this is not very new, I think, is my primary kind of problem with that. This is, you know, it's more or less a retro perspective already. This was kind of very prevalent in the 60s. Yeah, and I think it also has a relation to the kind of attempts to affirm reason and science or sort of futurity, which we see in a kind of what was maybe loosely a speculative materialist camp, Ray Brassier, Reza Negarestani, and but it's also been taken up and maybe put forth in its most crude form in the Accelerationist Manifesto. So broadly speaking, ontologically, capitalist society needs to bury the secret that social wealth is based on the extraction of surplus value. So while there are strong arguments for describing a capital-labour relation which has become dysfunctional to the reproduction of both poles of that relationship, a belief in capital's transcendence simply reposes capital's self-fulfilling tautology, that it is the self-positing agency which generates social wealth. Under conditions of real subsumption, we're forced to think in two contradictory ways. On the one hand, understanding that the real product is surplus value, which emphasises the action of man. On the other hand, capital appears as though it creates the excess of value itself. The complexity of the mediations of labour into profit and division of these profits at the level of social capital via markets, finance, social reproduction, the state, are indeed dizzying and specifically enculturated to keep and maintain an illusion that these are transparent and labour-free. So I think in some sense the work of kind of Marxist social criticism is always to show that this isn't the case, that this isn't just capital as an agent acting, you know, on itself, dominating us totally. It actually requires the integration of labour, requires the mediation of labour somehow, or in various ways. So now reification. The concept of reification, by which, quote, a definite social relation between men assumes the phantasmagoric form of a relation between things, receives different emphasis in the work of Lukács, Benjamin and Adorno. For Adorno, it is grounded in commodity exchange related to Marx's theory of value and developed to explain the ways that consciousness is determined by capital. However, as Gillian Rose has shown, this concept is derived by all three of these thinkers from George Simmel, not from Marx or Hegel. The rationalization projected onto capitalism by these thinkers, the perspective that the relations of production are further and further developed in line with the capitalist production process, the capitalist forces of production, is primarily derived from Max Weber. And this has had a huge influence on Western Marxism, and I think in some ways a distorting influence, though it's a compelling idea in itself. So moreover, this perspective maps onto historical developments by which the Soviet Union pursued a form of state capitalist development, staging in the late 20s and 30s its own hybrid form of socialist primitive accumulation. Whilst the most advanced Marxists in the West interpreted the post-Second World War compact between capital and labour and the widespread adoption of Keynesian measures by Western states as a fatal overcoming of proletarian antagonism and the end or suspension of the law of value. So there's a kind of notion in a kind of growing notion which begins to be posed in the 30s and 40s that after the Second World War, especially around the Frankfurt School, there's like a strong kind of conviction that the crises capital kind of experienced in the 19th century and all through the beginning of the 20th century are potentially over. So that there might no longer be any kind of big sort of global ruptures in kind of capital's path of accumulation. And moreover, that, and I'll come back to this again and again, the idea that the working class were integrated and no longer an antagonist to capital. And in a sense, from that viewpoint in the middle of the Second World, well, immediately after the Second World War, you could believe this to be the case. Like, there was no reason not to believe this to be the case. Okay, so this left the Frankfurt School, particularly Adorno, with a fundamental problem that if theories of capital might be developed, yet without an antagonist, without a subject at the centre of them, then revolution would be postponed forever. So therefore, a melancholic historical view held out that communism's telos, that it would kind of spring forth from the sort of ripeness of the conditions within capitalism for communism to supersede it, had been averted in the interwar period, specifically with the suppression of a revolution in Germany. So there was no telos any longer. There was no sort of narrative to sort of communism's overcoming. And moreover, as this kind of melancholy view became more and more, took hold more and more strongly, read backwards throughout time, since capital therefore had no historical basis, no relation to a struggle between classes, the whole of time became understood to be simply the maturation of forms of domination. So almost in this picture, capital's historical specificity is just discarded, sort of disappears. So we don't know how, for, say, Adorno, these views might have altered since he died in 1969, immediately after his death, with the beginnings of the end of this kind of compact between labour and capital, the explosion of an energy crisis and the subsequent political crises and struggles of the 70s, of which there are so many, it's impossible to list here. Seems that capital completely reversed the previous relationship, reversed this sort of moment of stability, and it became historical again. and sort of Capital set out on a thorough disintegration of almost all of the prior phase of the integration of the proletariat, so the breakup of productive infrastructure, the reconfiguration of unions, dismantling of free healthcare and education, and this sort of process that began in the late 60s or early 70s, we're still experiencing the effects of today. You could say it's also kind of an incomplete, like subsumption, it's a kind of incomplete revolution that keeps on going. Lucio Coletti, writing in the late 1970s, understood both reification and alienation as simply a form of revulsion, almost romantic revulsion at scientific intellect and technology. He saw this as a legacy of Bergsonism. So in this account, like Bergson, Adorno and Horkheimer sought to affirm a form of thinking and life which would unite reason and intuition in opposition to mere mechanism. There's some problems with this account, but I find it quite interesting nonetheless. So the attempt by Coletti, and even latterly by Lukács, to affirm reason and science in some ways could be seen as a bad and uncritical affirmation of just the opposite pole of a relation which couldn't truthfully face suffering without extending it interminably. So both Coletti and Lukács, in their respective points of writing, where they become extremely critical of vitalism, for Coletti that's the 1970s, for Lukács that's the 50s, they both kind of succumbed to a form of sort of Stalinist apology at this time. They're both kind of seeking to curry favour with their respective national communist parties. Their affirmation of a Marxist science was exactly the kind of object that the critical part of critical theory, as a code word for critical Marxism, had formed itself against. And this, the linguistic and the problem of language is perhaps an important kind of axis of clarification here. For Adorno had specifically attacked Bergson's attitude to language, so believing that the French philosopher's promise of forms of immediacy and intuition beyond the limitations of language to actually be entirely dependent on the rationality it scorned. The transcendental promise of Bergson's theory, pure becoming, and kind of historical unit or transhistorical unity, was merely compensation for a reified present and human finitude and death. So it was as much a mystification as the reality it sought to displace for Adorno. In this context, it's maybe interesting to reflect on an account of language and class as theorised by the Situationist International in 1963. They said in a text called All the King's Men, the problem of language is at the heart of all struggles between the forces striving to abolish the present alienation and those striving to maintain it. It is inseparable from the very terrain of those struggles. We live within language as within polluted air. Words work on behalf of the dominant organisation of life, yet they are not completely automated. They contain forces that can upset the most careful calculations. Words coexist with power in a relation analogous to that which proletarians, in the modern as well as the classical sense of the term, have with power. Employed by it almost full time, exploited for every sense and nonsense that can be squeezed out of them, they still remain, in some sense, fundamentally alien to it. So in the Situationist's account, one which had deep parallels with that of the Frankfurt School's theory of state capitalism, the very internality of the subject to language and the internality of proletarians to capital are brought into alignment, I think, in quite an interesting way. So what's strange, as we will shortly see, is that Adorno concurred with the basic terms of this discussion of language, but not in the sense of class. So Adorno remained committed, up to his death, remained committed to an account of a way thought could maintain separation even with what it is bound up in. And this approach for Adorno resolved into the dense parataxis of aesthetic theory, a kind of melancholy, what he called a melancholy science, which implied permanently suspended redemption. In this account, he posited art as a critical signpost for a utopia made out of this world, or made from this world, but pointing outside of it, which could only be achieved by a praxis which is suggested by art's existence, but barely possible, at least in the conditions, or kind of historical condition, that Adorno found himself in. I think it's of continuing significance that Adorno mediated his criticism of capitalism via an aesthetic theory. And this is kind of going to remain a bit underdeveloped, but maybe we could come back to it in the questions or discussion. With the kind of increasing contemporary interest in variants of value critique, which stem from the approach to Marx developed by Adorno's former students, as Helmut Reichelt, Hans-Jörg Backhaus, Hans-Jürgen Krau, in the late 1960s and 70s, it seems crucial to connect up these developments of a critical Marxist tradition stemming from Adorno's work with his views on aesthetics and art, through which he mediated his critique of political economy. So in some ways, like, just to position my own kind of working on this problem it's really like my own reception of Adorno's aesthetic theory and trying to understand the kind of like political foundations of that involves kind of reading it backwards through time to these much earlier texts, and also to his kind of dependence on other figures at the Frankfurt School and their kind of notion of, a particular notion of state capitalism, but like an account of capitalism which seemed to get quite stuck in a way and quite static in that sort of moment of the 60s. So the coordination of the dead. Reification, in the terms of political economy, meant for Adorno that exchange value had overcome use value. Intervention by the state in the economy meant that the free market was no longer free, and intervention in the lives of workers, coercion by unions, and a cushy welfare state supporting the reproduction of those who worked and their families, meant that the proletariat was no longer an antagonist to capital. Adorno's discussion of, quote, the subject as congealed technology is compelling, but it's also highly problematic. And I'm going to read an extended quote from a short text called Novicissimum Organum, which is in Minima Moralia. So he wrote, "The organic composition of man is growing. That which determines subjects as means of production and not as living purposes increases with the proportion of machines to variable capital. Only when the process that begins with the metamorphosis of labour power into a commodity has permeated men through and through and objectified each of their impulses as formally commensurable variations of the exchange relationship, is it possible for life to reproduce itself under the prevailing relations of production? Its consummate organisation demands the coordination of people that are dead. The will to live finds itself dependent on the denial of the will to live. Self-preservation annuls all life in subjectivity. Even what differs from technology in man is now being incorporated into it as a kind of lubrication. Psychological differentiation, originally the outcome both of the division of labour that dissects man according to sectors of the production process and of freedom, is finally itself entering the service of production. Here it is subjectivity itself, knowledge, temperament, and powers of expression that are reduced to an abstract mechanism, functioning autonomously and divorced from the personality of their owner and from the material and concrete nature of the subject matter in hand. So in many ways, this is Adorno's account of real subsumption, as far as you can kind of find it explicitly in his writing. The passage bears striking kind of resemblance to the post-autonomist literature of the 2000s, particularly that authored by Paolo Adorno and Antonio Negri. However, there are key distinctions to make. For Adorno, this state of affairs is a consequence of a revolution that was missed, a telos which will never arrive, history which will never begin. For the post-autonomists, in different ways and with different emphasis, this close binding of the labouring subject to capital, its subsumption of intellectual faculty to its ends, binds capital itself to the vicissitudes of the subject and life, or biopower. For Adorno, however, at least at this point, 1942, 1943, the law of values still exists. He understands, or he formulates the quote, the individuated function in the modern economy as a mere agents of the law of value. For others, Antonio Negri, Paolo Adorno, even Jacques Camat, the developments of the 1970s, the autonomisation of finance from productive industry, presages a suspension of the law of value. Whether this is latterly the case for Adorno remains the subject of some debate. Late texts such as Aesthetic Theory and Late Capitalist or Industrial Society suggests that he also kind of gave up on the law of value, thought it didn't exist anymore. And yet, most likely this was arrived at from a kind of heterodox position, not necessarily assimilable to the same periodization that, say, Antonio Negri arrives at in the 1970s. Diverse formulations of the idea that exchange value had overcome use value, quote, that the goods made available today are a kind of pseudo-consumer goods. Exchange value is substituted for use value, which was from a discussion between Horkheimer and Adorno, occur across a number of post-war texts. But the problem with this, as Gillian Rose points out, is that without a theory of surplus value, it's difficult or even prohibitive to ground the formation of classes at all. And so it's not a surprise that in 1968 Adorno would write, quote, "Everything socially existent today is so thoroughly mediated that even the moment of mediation is itself distorted by the totality. There is no standpoint outside the whole affair which can be referred to, from which the ghost could be called by its name. The false identity between the constitution of the world and its inhabitants through the total expansion of techniques, is leading in the direction of the confirmation of the relations of production, whose true beneficiaries one searches for in vain, just as proletarians have become invisible. So, final or penultimate section, a nothing with a vengeance. The invisibility of the proletariat, the non-contradiction between the forces of production and relations of production, were merely the latest in a long sequence of formulations emanating from the Frankfurt School, which, by reducing the ontology of productive labour to the ontology of exchange, contribute to a sense of total social control by a unitary global force rather than by a social relation, which is underpinned between the contradiction between an automatic subject, capital, and a subject which shows signs of both automatism and agency. That would be the working class. Whilst capitalist reproduction and the reproduction of labour power increasingly diverge, there is no reproduction of capital without reproduction of the capital-labour relation. For Adorno and the Frankfurt School, the fundamental mistake was to seek a standpoint outside the capital-labour relation. This outside never existed. It was not proposed, and certainly wasn't proposed by Marx. Rather, the position of labour power from the standpoint of capital is nothing, the negating nothing that counts from the standpoint of revolution. Marx wrote of the proletariat in relation to private property. Proletariat and wealth are opposites, as such they form a single whole. They are both creations of the world of private property. The proletariat, on the contrary, is compelled as proletariat to abolish itself and thereby its opposite, private property, which determines its existence and which makes it proletariat. It is the negative side of the antithesis, its restlessness within its very self, dissolved and self-dissolving private property. So I've argued elsewhere that we might usefully think this ostensible unfreedom through two formulations of double freedom. The first is that formulated by Karl Marx as the double freedom of labour power, free to sell itself as a commodity, free from ownership of property or means of production, to work or starve. Art, on the other hand, according to Immanuel Kant, must be doubly free in an almost symmetrically opposite sense. Free from wage labour, but also like labour, free from owning a commodity or other service to sell, though, quote, satisfied and amused without looking to some other purpose. And I think my argument here is that, that we can't, that I think for sort of Adorno and other members of the Frankfurt School and for situationists, they kind of mixed and fused both these double freedoms, both these versions of double freedom. So there's a kind of like always a kind of nagging sort of desire to affirm something like Kantian freedom, and maybe not a sort of strict adherence to the kind of almost satire of Kantian freedom that Marx formulates, and this kind of is the motor for the melancholy that both these accounts generate, and it's quite still popular today. These are each forms of autonomy, but they give themselves to further analysis rather than simple affirmation. Before capital, this subject did not exist. Outside of wage relations, this subject is nothing, the subject as a mere automaton would be an expensive piece of machinery for capital to maintain. It would be incapable of producing value. The values fed into it would simply be emptied back out into the production process, be a zero-sum game. Capital can only put to work, that is, to extract surplus value from a thinking subject. And I suggest that we have to kind of come back to this position to think and work on our critique of capital. There is no longer, or never was, total social domination, but instead totally dysfunctional social domination, which only partially integrates its subjects. With the production of a global surplus population, there is an increasing disconnect between the reproduction of capital and the reproduction of labour power. Those things appear to be getting more and more distant. Nonetheless, everywhere alternative forms of reproduction are laid to waste or reintegrated back into capitalist accumulation. So I would argue that the law of value still holds, but since it is a limit capital can overcome only in an illusory sense, this is a scene of desperate crises for capital. As a shrinking base of production of productive capital supports an increasingly wobbly edifice, would-be workers must increasingly bend themselves out of shape to have even a passing chance of being employed. Work and employment take on dimensions of, or aspects of voluntarism. And I would argue that art, for example, appears as a ground for this kind of real-life training, a sort of speculative work, or preparation for work readiness. And this partially absorbs a privileged part of the surplus population, but this is not enough for us. This is a little kind of to end the formal part of my presentation. To quote Adorno, there's still tenderness only in the coarsest demand that no one shall go hungry anymore. And I think, if you hold to that perspective, a lot of this other kind of illusion of total social domination or not is pretty irrelevant. So, but I think it's still an interesting thing to unpick. So now I just have a series of kind of questions and kind of suggestions for discussion. The idea of my paper was to eventually kind of try to, having sort of unpicked maybe Adorno's view of political economy, to kind of go back to sort of his sort of structural account of art and art's agency and art's kind of own kind of aesthetic critique of capitalism. But I failed to do that work, so I just got some pointers. So one thing was Martine and I had a really interesting exchange on kind of art and science and the idea of truth content. And I'd be quite interested to try and animate that discussion again. In Adorno's account, truth content is the cognitive content of artworks. It's, if science makes an objective claim to truth, it does this according to Adorno by excluding the body and excluding the subjectivity of the kind of scientist, witness, objective figure. Then artworks can be said to have a non-objective and cognitive content, which is the sum of the encounter phase stage between the apparently subjective activity of the artist, the objectivity, materiality of the materials, which are products of capital, and the perception by a viewer, also a subject, who kind of surrenders in some sense to the object. So the idea is that these relations have social truth built into them, and they kind of invest the lie of the subject or subjectivity, but reveal it as a kind of myth. The truth content is a material fact of these relations as figured by the aleatory interaction of forces presented through art. As truth, it's a much weaker claim than that of sciences, but that's why for Adorno it's seen as more powerful, because it doesn't commit violence to its subject, or to the object or subject. Yeah, but it does actually kind of transmit the violence, which is the memory of historical suffering, which is bound up in material and bound up in the relations. So just to, maybe in Adorno's own words, and I think this is, quote, perspectives must be fashioned that displace and estrange the world, reveal it to be, with its rifts and crevices, as indigent and distorted as it will appear one day in the messianic light. To gain such perspectives without velleity or violence, entirely from felt contact with its objects, this alone is the task of thought. It is the simplest of all things, because the situation calls imperatively for such knowledge. Indeed, because consummate negativity, once squarely faced, delineates the mirror image of its opposite. So, in the discussion I was having with Martin, there's a kind of idea that maybe, like, I would read this statement that obviously that this is Adorno's kind of thought, which is tied up with an idea of modernist art. So art which kind of estranges habitual perception, it kind of breaks and shocks that. And that's important for Adorno because he's kind of grounded. Subjects for him in capitalism are rarefied subjects. Their thinking is constrained, it's determined by capitalist social relations. It can't think outside of that. It needs this shock from habituated perception to kind of like be able to maybe perceive an emancipatory path. But interesting, when Martin and I were discussing it, in a way, Martin was saying sort of science has this perspective, like science is more the vehicle for this kind of shock, this kind of like estranging perception, this sort of breaking with, and essentially breaking with sort of phenomenological experience. So, and I think it's, I'm kind of interested in, for Adorno, it's like there's a sense that art can no longer maybe achieve that perspective anymore. It kind of goes into a sort of anti-art. It has to break its own concepts in order to sort of, and with kind of less and less sort of results. In a way, it gets worn out. And in a way, I'm saying that's Adorno's account is kind of tied up with this kind of sort of terminal logic picture of total domination, which wasn't true historically, is conceptually questionable. So I'm not sure that I also would, take seriously his account of the end of art, but I'm also at a loss to sort of project a different account at this point. So, Martin, do you want to respond to that at all?
I ask about a very simple question. If there is no total social domination, where exactly is the room for agency? Which, and maybe I'll just contextualize a bit in relationship to Adorno, which is it kind of the agency that okay. So that's my very simple question, and as a kind of critique of Adorno is that the agency that he claims, it requires quite an elitist subject to appreciate the truth content of artwork. And talking about violence, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but when you deal with Adornians, I found myself to feel as the most stupid human being on earth. You know, it's it's like that's the simple question that I'm asking you. It's just like I'm not that subject who is able to appreciate the potential for artworks to generate some agency. So, the question: if there is no total social domination, as you said, where exactly is the room for agency?
Voice historical stuffing. I mean, I think. Oh no, it's too much.
I think it wasn't me, but I might be wrong.
Just performing your
anxiety.
Your affect of talking to Adorno.
Okay.
Yeah, so
it was Adorno. It was Adorno.
I did it. I mean, I think that I just think that because Adorno sees like he's trying to formulate a communist politics in some way, but he's got this kind of problem because his kind of school of thought is basically seeing no agency for the working class in that. So he's also got, obviously, he holds on not to some sort of class perspective, but it is a class perspective. It's one in which bourgeois thought is the context. Bourgeois thought is a kind of highest culture. It's the highest sort of freedom that's been achieved, and that sort of that seeing that the destruction of that in the Second World War, and to a certain extent in really existing socialism in the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc is the sort of, in a way, a kind of the horror of that he tries to mobilise something which can kind of properly contend with it. I just see the agency like not in this outside standpoint, trying to find an outside standpoint, but rather just to say that in the relationship of capital to labour, you have thought. It's not that thought is excluded. Like the capital mobilises necessarily a thinking subject. We all have access to that plasticity of thought. I think that both of us actually draw a lot on, something like aesthetic experiences, musical experiences to precisely kind of break with and have a perspective that grates against the one that's kind of expected of you, the one that's purely instrumental. And all of us have some access to that non-instrumentalized experience, and in a way, that's where the agency is, but also that agency is there as far as we confront capitalism, not find some sort of outside or like a nice half hour listening to music on our headphones, something, But it is maybe that experience is a sort of resource that gives us the energy to, you know, to make those moves in some sense.
I'm thinking that we are really short of time.
Okay.
So maybe
We can wrap up. Yeah, fine.
Afterwards with Marina, because if not, do you think it's fine with that, or because?
Yeah, that's okay. That's fine.
So we keep some questions for Anthony after Marina, because we have then some time for debate. Otherwise, we will go.
Sure.
So thanks a lot.
Thank you.